Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Whenever you happen to stand in this Truth Bomb Riff, my name is Patrick Lovell. I am the producer with the $71 trillion truth. And we are recording this on Sunday, March 1st, 2026. And I am joined by my colleague, my friend, someone who I've grown to respect immensely over the course of the last, well, let's call it a year of interacting in terms of a lot of material, but it's getting more and more in tune with, I think, what we've been talking about for some time. And I think I've neglected to say your name, actually, Regan Boycheck, of course, who hails from Alberta, Canada. He has, I believe, a master's in political science. I said PhD last time, but also you've been a journalist for some time. You're also independent. You work very hard maintaining the world that you live in. I think supporting six children. Is that right?
Uh, Blended family, yeah.
Okay, in addition to those things that require unbelievable time and effort and energy to be able to keep and uh, you know keep up to speed on, in addition to having the knowledge that you do. So, I certainly appreciate you as a person, but I don't want the audience to not understand that in this age of fake media, of people who get paid a lot of money to deliver a lot of bullshit, how hard it is to maintain being on top of things while all obviously dealing with other responsibilities as well. And I thought that was worth mentioning, considering that Friday late night, Saturday morning, I guess it was about 2 a.m. my time, when President Trump, and I was deep asleep getting ready for my next day, which turned out to be a fun day, but it was kind of crazy, all things considered, because of course the United States and Israel carried out many, many attacks on Iran, which seemed to be inevitable and predictable, all things considered, for some time, but particularly, I think, in light of the last sort of batch of Epstein files and everything else I saw all over social media. Um, hey, I guess it's a good time to start a war. And of course, it's ridiculous, but yet here we are. But it wasn't the Epstein files. This thing has been 4 decades in the making. I mean, there's certainly maybe a timing scenario there, and I don't want to not give what I know now, particularly on Friday. I don't know if you happen to catch it, but I did an interview with a guy by the name of Nick Bryant who revealed just unbelievably startling information, and he was on the Epstein story before anybody else was, quite frankly, and he comes with the receipts. But when you understand that information, you kind of think, yeah, it is possible that the timing of the distraction, I mean, it was like good timing because of a lot of other things that are going on. So there's a lot I want to bring to this dialogue. I want to bring the long view, the lens. I know that you and I both understand what's happened in the region over the course of the last 25 years since 9/11. We definitely have a long view of it as well. There's a lot to get to, but I want to ask you what your kind of initial reaction was and kind of what you've been thinking about over the course of the last, let's call it 24 hours, and how you set the table for how you're looking at what's going on in this conflict.
Well, I'm someone who was going to school during the Second Intifada and the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. I was a vice president of the Palestinian Club on campus and led the march protesting before the invasion of Iraq. And so it's kind of surreal to show up to work on Saturday morning and to hear the news that they really are attacking Iran, and they didn't even bother with the whole dog and pony show that we watched 20 years ago. That we're doing the same thing for the same reasons, and this time they don't even bother to put on a show. It is naked, and the fact that it was preceded by document dumps, both by Trump's administration on Epstein and on the Israeli side. In the Israeli media, a new batch of rare documents about the 1948 ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians that just puts a nail in the coffin of any narrative about we used to think about what happened back then, and puts today's news in a different sort of light. That what happened in 1948 has been happening for the last couple of years, and the sort of characters that do that is the Epstein class, the imperial class, the royalty, who own everything by violence and enjoy being above the law, enjoy not having to pay their debts, which is how they get where they are. They're not elite because they're smart, they're elite because they're untouchable. And that doesn't breed competence, and it's on display in surreal reality. So it's for all of the stories that everyone had about how things worked or how you reform the system, those are all gone. And people are left moreless. Things are crazier than they've ever been, but people know less, understand less, are more atomized than they ever have been. There's more censorship, more a lack of there's no channel to tune into. We're not singing from the same song sheet. Nobody to the fact that anybody's paying attention. You're paying attention to thousands of different channels that are just generating bad faith. But the story that you lived 20 years ago personally, and the story of oil that I've been studying for the last 25 years, they're converging. The environmental story, climate change, they're converging at breakneck speed. And we don't have to sort through the lies. That's a big bonus. In the old days, when you have a smooth talk and BSer, that's now it's bare knuckle. It's easy for everyone to see, but it's hard to make sense of because we don't have the right framework. Because you're not allowed to say the word imperialism. You can say pedophiles or whatever, and that's satanic. We can stop thinking there's no more analysis required, and I think that's why it's dropped so often, because they're not there for the girls. They're imperialists. And it's not some private citizen doing. They're not so sneaky. This is higher than states. This is the imperial class. These are the guys that get you there in Davos, where you don't have to write anything down. Everybody can get on the same page, and they manage things. They're the ones who control the banks and the collateral that determine what's going to happen. And a lot of the Western world, including places like Canada, that thought we were better than you, that we were different. We're starting to no parade. We're a colony. We're not free. We're not better. We are reporting for duty in Iran. Sir, go get them. We're on. That has nothing to do with Canadians. That doesn't reflect anything that happens here, anything any but real person feels or thinks here. There's no constituency, but there's a few simple facts about colonies. That a lot of the colonies since World War II are secret. Canada is a secret American colony. So is Palestine. And I can explain how all that works and how that made it past the United Nations. But today, what it means is colonies don't set foreign policy. It's just a rule. You don't have to guess about it. There's no, is it, we support you in Iran, in whatever you want, sir. And that goes for every other secret colony. Places like Germany and Japan, they never got independent after the Second World War. Canada, who signed a secret military treaty in 1940, Roosevelt then went to Mexico and signed a very similar treaty with Mexico. And then he went to Brazil and signed a very similar treaty with Brazil. And so they're in very similar secret colony situations. Norway was added to that list in 2022, right before the Nord Stream bombing that the Norwegian military participated in. And so all of these countries, we thought we were independent. We thought we were democratic. We thought we had free press. We thought we were better than those barbaric Americans. And it turns out that either our politicians are just really, really, really stupid, or we're a colony and they're not actually independent to set policy. And that's why all these countries don't follow their national interest. They just follow America like lapdogs, as if they were convinced. And so it's easy to believe they were blackmailed by some high flying private citizen or some evil Jew somewhere. Uh, and those are dangerous ideas that are gaining a lot of attraction in the absence of a real explanation. But they never held any water the last few times they were drug out. They don't this time. But our stories have converged, and the way Wall Street works and the way the American system still has these relics of the American Revolution, the ideals that you hang out front and you talk about, whether you honor them in practice or not, they're still there. And if you're smart enough, like Bill Black, no matter what the odds are, you might be able to jujitsu those against the imperialists, maybe 7,000 times. And so um, I learned about Bill Black from Patrick and the con. And then I went back and read everything that Bill Black had ever written. And that's how I learned how Alberta worked and the oil industry worked. And Patrick is the only real journalist I've ever found. I've spent 30 years doing this sort of work as just a laborer, but I keep finding this stuff. And I went to journalism school, but never worked as a journalist. So I know all the journalists, been feeding them stories. I know all of them on a first name basis for decades, but they don't write about this stuff and they're not allowed. And it's the strangest things, no matter how awesome they were until we got here. And Patrick's the only real, actual, like what I was taught as a kid, journalists were. And he never quit either. And the Clean New Deal just takes that one step forward as what's left of the American system. It's not all gone yet.
Hanging on by a
It's
thread.
hanging on the edge.
Hanging on by a thread, man.
But the new untouchables are still there. Uh, the edifice is still there. The potential is still there. And that's how you pay for things. And so things are crazier and crazier. And that fits all of our stories like a puzzle piece, yeah, and increases our confidence that all of these pieces are right. This is where we're going. It explains every morning. Things make more sense. And if we could share that, it's like a secret decoder ring. It's intellectual self-defense. You immediately see the bullshit. And the key is to having decent politics. There's a difference between good faith and bad faith. Elites lie, cheat, and never tell a straight story because they can't, because there's a democracy. It just doesn't work. And that's what we see everywhere, because those are the guys who own the media and control the media. But there's a simple rule in life and everything else. Anyone who shows bad faith should be persona non grata. They are not, that's not acceptable society. Like, you have absolutely no place in public life. If you demonstrate bad faith, then have fun, do something else, but don't ever come anywhere near public life, because for anything to work, it needs to be civil society needs to be premised on good faith. And so when an elite or a journalist demonstrate their bad faith, thank them. Now you know you don't ever have to listen to them again, ever pay attention, ever trust them ever again. Pay no mind to them and keep looking, because there are decent people out there. We all know every one of our lives is filled with good faith, real people. Can't find them on TV and you can't find them in public office, but they're everywhere. They are a majority. That's why they're so dangerous. And if they understood the con and the New Deal, they would understand what's going on, and we would have a fighting chance at the Americans putting an end to this. It's the root of what ails most of us is American imperialism, and now it's naked and undeniable. But there's Bill Black, there's the Clean New Deal, there's the new untouchables, and that's how you pay for it. We can have a decent world within boundaries, and we can pay for it. All we have to do is to enforce the law on everybody and enforce double entry bookkeeping. That's all. This fraud is just a trick of banking or timing, and double entry bookkeeping can sort it all out. We've got all the math these days. It can be done if we know what we're looking for, and the new untouchables are those people. Everyone can see it. They don't know what to do, and it sounds incredibly arrogant to say Patrick's got it figured out. But it really is not that complicated. It really is that simple, and that's where the power is hidden, in those assumptions that shape every the way we see everything. And if those assumptions are just a little bit off, we can't possibly see imperialism. If you're not allowed to say it, you can't think it. But that's the potential, and that's the danger, is that public awareness could flip things like a switch, because the same way civil society doesn't operate without a certain level of cooperation, this facade of elite governance rests on that illusion. They cannot rule by force. They'll try to intimidate, but even the worst Eastern European tyrant relies on public opinion, and there's limits to what they can do. And it's up to Americans to change that, because it's been slow boiling frogs of what they've gotten away with Americans. But it's Americans are the only people left on the earth who can shape the limits of the American government. And the consequences are very real and literal these days. But there's enough left of the American ideal and the rule of law that there is potential. And thank goodness that you've left a record of this sort of integrity in journalism to just demonstrate that's the most valuable thing, is that good example that it is possible. And it's been an enormous benefit to my work here. We couldn't be further removed. But the truth and logic that you uncovered is the same thing, gave rise to all the problems I have here. That is the same thing feeding a weekend war after the stock markets have closed. And the United Nations Security Council is going to open on Monday, chaired by the First Lady. Miss Trump is going to be hosting the Security Council meeting. Saturday Night Live couldn't write this stuff.
Well, I'm going to pick up there. First of all, thank you for that. Really, I'm humbled by what you had to say, and especially because I want to demonstrate to the fine folks out there how people of different ideology initially and different sorts of backgrounds can not kind of, what am I talking about? Over the course of now decades, arrive at the same conclusion in a way that I would have never thought possible. And I'll give you an understanding how. But I want to address a few things you said first. The first was Canada kind of going along to get along, and the lies and so on and so forth. Mark Carney, as much as he gave kind of this independent speech that was celebrated at Davos, is still the Goldman Sachs guy, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. And it is government Sachs. And it's more than that now. It has been government Sachs for a long time, but particularly with a lot of the prime ministers and the leaders of Europe, the UK, so on and so forth, throughout, they've all gotten their pedigree, quite frankly, from Goldman Sachs, which is what the baseline for a lot of this stuff is. Now, as it relates to something I thought was really important to say for me. So when I go back to, let's say, 1987-ish, you and I would not have been in the same room together on the same page because, as I've mentioned many of my truth bombs before, and I've been very transparent about this, I'm Jewish. I do believe in the state of Israel, or at least differently than I do now. Let's put it that way. I was always supportive of Israel my whole life. And my really ultimate formulation of my construct my thinking, my ideology, my everything was informed by the Holocaust, which was then, because of my upbringing and what I understand, 1,000 years, quite frankly, of anti-Semitism. Now, as a Jewish person, you have to understand, I've never been religious. I've never been super committed. I come from a mixed background. My dad comes from his, mother was Lutheran originally, whole family from Germany. Ultimately, the white German Lutheran background is my father's side of the family, right? And then, ironically, my mom's from the Ukrainian side and Jewish. And the biggest influencer in my life was my granddad, who was a business guy, and he was a real showman. He started he and his cousins created it was the largest club in Manhattan during the Great Gatsby time period. So they were players in New York. And he was a Wall Street lawyer, and then he ended up in oil and gas. Okay. After the Great Depression, he relocated with his brothers and started a business down in Houston, Texas, in oil and gas, and he was an oil broker. And so I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I understood, let's say, Zionism a certain way, and I understood Israel a certain way, and I also understood the oil and gas industry a certain way. All those things were basically what fomented my upbringing. Now, my father was an attorney and a senior attorney. He actually rose to general counsel status, which is the top attorney of a very large natural gas company that specialized in liquefied natural gas. So he was in shipping and tanking and in all of the all of the work that was in pipelines and all of those sorts of things that are very, considerable in Alberta as well, right? So I've always understood the business sort of thing, right? But the reason I wanted to start with, you and I would have been on different sides of the fence in 1987, was such that, the Intifada, as I recall, and I'm just going to touch this and you can circle back to it, but I want to make a broader point if I may. But it was a continuation, and I understood all of the manifestations of what happened during the Balfour Declaration, all of the stuff, right? Some people call it terrorism, some people call it, a fight for independence or survival, and blah, blah, blah. And it gets deeper and deeper, and it foments into the Nakba, and on one side, and the other side, again, a foothold. Okay, survival after the Holocaust, 6 million dead, yada, yada, yada. Okay. You get into the situation in 1987 for me, where I'm looking at it through the lens of, okay, I'm seeing well, we called them homicide bombings at the time. You would have called it acts of liberation. But, with people that would strap themselves with belts and shrapnel and get on buses and go into cafes and wipe out 30 or 40 people at a time. And that happened a lot. And then it would go into all of the manner, shape, or form of all of the other things that were going on at that time period. And by the way, at least we forget, Yasser Arafat at that time was taking billions of dollars from the European Union. And his wife had a place in Paris, and she was living large. And the lens that I was looking at it was the Palestinian Authority was corrupt to the gills, and they weren't an honest broker. Now, meanwhile, I had no idea that 20 years later, the likes of Sheldon Adelson would come out of that. Okay. So the reason I make that statement up front is because when the wall got built, and I just want to plant the seed first, and I'll give you a chance to respond to this, but I want to make the broader point first. When the wall got built, at that time period, and we know we could fast forward a little bit, and then we get into, the likes of the effort of my favorite anti-fascist of all time, Roger Waters, and of course his anti-BDS movement. Well, he was a part of the BDS movement and all the other things. So I've tracked on all that stuff the whole time, but I wanted to give you this as context because I know, because we come from the same generation, that you'll appreciate this. And I was always on the side. For example, Warren Zevon was a musician that really captured the spirit of who I was, particularly at that time period. And there was two songs that exemplified his mindscape that really kind of created a bit of a paradox for me, right? The first was the headless, I always forget the first name, Roland, the headless Thompson gunner. And that was a very anti-imperialism, Northern Ireland, pro-Palestinian, anti-imperialist sort of international sort of goings on that was at that time. Now, another influential punk rocker at that time was huge for me was Joe Strummer of the Clash, and I remember understanding the Clash's, or I should say, Joe Strummer's position on a lot of these things. So all of this manifested out of World War II. All of this manifested after the different divvying ups of empire and how things would operate in that post mortem, if you will, that was undergirded by all of these regional conflicts that would lead to all sorts of other things, right? Particularly for me, in the background of my mind. So Israel, 1947, then UN declaration, and then moving forward, the wars, particularly of 67 and 73. Now, the reason I bring that up is because at that time it's Egypt, it's Jordan, it's Syria, it's all of the different, you know, regional players. I don't believe Saudi Arabia, minus maybe, I'm not sure what Saudi's role was, quite frankly, and I know Iran was a little bit spread out at that time period in other involvement, and then you learn the Shia and Sunni thing downstream. But throughout all those wars, Israel appears to be attacked. Okay, that's the way I've always looked at it in my lens. They fight back, they gain territory. And to my knowledge, they're the only, let's call it imperial power in history that has gained territory in war and then given it back because of negotiations that have happened after the fact. Okay, so that was one of the lenses that I would look through it at that time period. But at the same time, I kept thinking to myself, and the reason I stated that I came from Houston, Texas, in the oil and gas industry was that I always understood oil. Okay, I understood oil, and I understood the Suez Canal, and I understood 1973, particularly when the Israelis gave back the Suez Canal, or excuse me, the Sinai to Egypt. Of course, and I'll show a map here. In fact, I may as well share it right now. Let me just share the map. But so for people that are trying to kind of get their heads around, especially if you're young, guys, this conflict's been going on for a very long time. But, and by the way, I know I'm bouncing all over the place, but the other song that I wanted to reference from Warren Zevon was Lawyers, Guns, and Money. Okay? Because that was like, okay, conjugate all of this other shit, this undergirded kind of shadow sector of what was the CIA and all things, involved with drug trafficking and money laundering and ultimately arms dealership, that was undergirding everything that took place, particularly in Conjugate, which is a huge part of what's going on right now. Because Iran was in a war with Iraq. We got weapons to Iraq via Iran. We played both sides, but we got weapons to Iran through Israel. I'll go into that in a minute. But the reason I wanted to point out the Suez Canal first is, it's this tiny partition. I think it's like 17 miles wide. That comes out, we got Saudi Arabia down here, right? Or is actually, that's Yemen. And then Saudi Arabia, and then it's Iraq is over here. And then this is Saudi. But all of the huge, I think like 1/5 of all oil of the world's production comes through this, this very narrow stretch, right? And so within all of those wars, there were deals that were made that would ultimately make sure that all of the parties involved got their share of it. That's how we paid it off, right? You got Saudi here, you got Jordan, you got Syria, you got the sliver of Israel, the West Bank, and of course the Gaza, and then you've got Sinai, and then Egypt, right? And so we've had, over the course of since 9/11, the Middle East has been in constant turmoil. It's been a war zone. It's been a bloody war zone. And we've had millions of lives lost post 9/11, right? Not only was there a war in Iraq, there was a war in Afghanistan and everything that goes with it, but there was also the reaction in Syria, and then all things that, Jordan's been relatively quiet, but we know what, Dubai is in the UAE. It's a money laundering enterprise. You've got Qatar. You've got these small nation states next to Kuwait. Don't forget we had Gulf War I and all of these things. Now, I know I'm bouncing around and I'm doing the long lens, right? And I just want people to kind of absorb as we're looking here. U.S. reports casualties as missile fire pounds. Let's see what it says here. Missile fire pounds Mideast. Yeah, deadly strikes hit Israel and Gulf as Iran retaliates. I guess they're striking tankers. They're also hitting other states. I saw that there was a high rise in Dubai that got hit by some sort of ordinance, and this thing can spin out of control. And we know this has been 4 decades in the making. It says here the CIA helped pinpoint gathering Iranian leaders. Trump stays out of public view. Go figure, Mr. McKinkle's taco tits, who had 5 bone spurs, leading a military that is, if anything, we've become Blackwater, the United States of Blackwater, right? Blackwater is a bunch of mercenaries that have come back from 20 years of war working for these Gulf states that have gotten paid freelance kind of money. And the rest of our military is what? Young kids who have no correlation of what's going on. So one thing I want to say to the audience, and I'll tee you up because I know I'm meandering, but at the same time, I think it's going to set the table for a really, really important dialogue. So let me just kind of stop sharing here for a second. So I started with, you and I would have been on a different side of the table in '87, but I had to face reality on a lot of planes that I didn't anticipate when I was a young lad. Okay, coming from my white privileged upper middle class background of a professional family, deeply involved. That was, oh yeah, Jewish on one side of my family, but I've always been Jewish. Let's put it this way. If the Nazis came barking at my door, they wouldn't give a fuck that half of my family looks and sounds like they do. They'd be like, no, this guy's a Jew. Okay. I always had this kind of like sarcastic sort of, like fuck everybody who's a racist, right? You're just idiots. It's an easy way for people to be glommed on and pretend like there's something that's not somebody else. It's us or them. But post 1987, the right-wing Jews that started getting funding, the settlers, from the likes of Sheldon Adelson and others in that cadre that would ultimately become super allied with the likes, and at least I mentioned literally the one family that everybody who's been anti-Semitic for years always goes to first. And I always thought this was insane because I ended up learning more about what they actually did. The Rothschilds, right?
Yeah.
The Rothschilds were deeply involved because of just the nature of the historical way of lending in Europe. They were just really good at managing money, but they ended up doing front running. But then they managed the war chest for both these idiot aristocrats all over Europe, and they just basically bankrolled these guys. And it wasn't them that were creating the wars; they were just managing the money. But at the same time, as we both know, a lot of these idiot aristocrats would get themselves bankrupt. And there was all sorts of strange plays that happened throughout all that. Okay, so why do I bring up the Rothschilds? Well, because the Rothschilds, as it turns out, end up with this hedge fund that's run by a guy by the name of Wilbur Ross, another guy who's Jewish, and he ends up becoming Trump's commerce secretary during the first administration. But Wilbur Ross and the Rothschilds bailed out Trump of one of his many bankruptcies, but it was a big one back in the late 80s, early 90s. So they had some sort of hold on Trump from the beginning. I don't know exactly what it was, but they had some sort of hold, okay? So I'd mentioned Sheldon Adelson, and I know Sheldon Adelson's background, and I know that in Israel, there was a sharp divide between, Israel for the most part, and you could probably debate this and challenge me on this, but from what I remember, there was a lot of socialists that created kibbutzes in Israel from the early stages, and they were ideologically socialist, okay? But there was always that other side, that financial side, that would ultimately become now a tech powerhouse, right? Because ultimately what I started to see manifest over the course of, let's say, the 2000s post 9/11 primarily, right? You've got this incredible what's the word I'm looking for? There's an alliance between the Koch brother Heritage Foundation, which tends to be John Birch Society, which tends to be, quite frankly, neo-Nazi in a lot of ways. And they combined with the likes of the Sheldon Adelson pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, which a lot of people would refer to it. And they become kind of this thing. that's patchworked together by none other than the Christian coalition that starts during Reagan, but it manifests into this evangelical sort of uh, uber Christian Zionist scenario. Okay. So as all of this is happening, me coming from this background of when a lot of people back in those days would have called someone like me a Zionist, the background that I came from was like, okay, there's scientists, there's doctors, there's lawyers, there's economists, there's professionals, right? That come from this Jewish sort of educational upbringing, violinists, music, people of let's just say the meritocracy or academia. Okay, that's where I would have come out of that sort of thing, right? And they were all they're not global elitists, at least not that I saw back in those days. They weren't trying to destroy the world. They were trying to survive the world they came out of, which was the Holocaust. But then here comes this tough guy, Adelson, who was literally like mob-like back in Boston back in the day, before he goes to Vegas, before he becomes this kingpin and then becomes uber billionaire. And I've mentioned in many of my truth bombs that guy was worth 46 billion or so right before the 2008 great financial crisis. And then he got down to like 2 billion after. I mean, he lost like $44 billion. And then 2 years after that, he bounced right back up to 46 billion. Who the fuck does that? Okay, people that are plugged in. And let me tell you how and why, because of what Reagan said earlier. Yeah, I do have a lot of the answers, and it is easy. It's not rocket science. It's racketeering and many other things. And we're going to expose that in a minute. But I want to just plant the seed first, and then I want to bring this to a close because I've been meandering. But I think it's important to set that table, right? Because Trump is a mob boss. He's a 5-time freaking coward that got out of military service, that's now leading a junta-like paramilitary force, which is ICE, in the United States, waging a war against American citizens and everybody else. Pretend like it's the brown people. That doesn't matter. You can't wage war against brown. Just laws out the window. The guy's gotten $4 billion in the first year. Crypto, Bitcoin, this, that, and the other, whatever. But it's all backdoored from all of these fossil fuel nations. Okay, via UAE, and then let's we forget this just was something that took place like 2 weeks ago. CZ, Mr. Binance, that was in prison for the racketeering and all of the other things that CZ was involved with for laundering, made a deal, got pardoned, and yet he's funding money to Iran, for example. Okay, this is just revealed a couple of weeks ago. So what we're in the midst of, as far as I can tell, is a plan of 4 decades in the making that veered right hardcore, particularly after the Intifada, particularly after the wall, because the right-wing forces in Israel were the money class, the Epstein class, that had been involved with some freaking nefarious stuff for a very long time, and they figured out a way to create the Abraham Accords with Saudi. You've got MBS, who might be in the MBS files. Maybe he was doing all sorts of. I know Saudis were all over Vegas and California in the early 90s. I can tell you that, sleeping with hookers and doing all sorts of things that would be against the so-called profile of, being, a bearer of Islam. And so maybe Epstein had stuff on MBS. I don't know. All I know is that there is a meeting of the minds between Vladimir Putin, MBS, Ukraine, Palestine, whatever, Israel, Greater Israel Project, whatever. And in Iran was some sort of barter, in my opinion. I'm projecting my opinion. Because if Trump is hands off in Ukraine and Russia can control whatever its hemisphere is, I guess the final question after everything I've been laying out here is, doesn't it seem like if we were to go back to 1987 and this level of aggression by Israel and the United States towards Iran happened then, there would have been a global war. There would have been a global war. But right now, because Russia would not have tolerated that, Russia would have launched something and it may have turned into a nuclear war or whatever. But now we know that Iran provides an enormous amount of oil to China. Okay? So I have no idea what the plan is here, because they're all criminals, at least on our side. There's no question about it. And, like I said, Thompson, the headless hunter, and then ultimately lawyers, guns, and money turns out to be the projection, with only the thing missing is AI. And really that's it, because Peter Thiel and all things, well, and we could say NVIDIA too, but all things obviously Palantir, the test run was Gaza. It was a setup. I think 9/11 was a setup. I've said it before that we knew where the terrorist cells were. We knew who was paying them. We could have thwarted 9/11 like that. It didn't happen. We had 25 years. This is part of the plan. I've said a lot. So I'll be really curious to see how you respond to it.
No, I think you've been perceptive over the last 40 years. That's what you were swimming in. You've seen it change. You see its alien dominance today. And I just have a little bit of a different perspective, a framing, longer term framing of it that really helps to make sense of it. Because I live in a British oil colony. And the British king used to control 40% of the livable surface of the planet before oil.
Right.
And British royalty discovered oil in northern Alberta in 1715, before there was a British Empire. They were kicking the Irish's, they were in Ireland, but there was no big empire. And they found oil in Alberta first, before the Middle East, before anything. And that was a game. In the grand scheme of the British Empire, they had all the oil you could ever need in
Wait a
northern
second. Did they
Alberta, all
discover
of it.
that before Pennsylvania? Did they know the usage? I mean, I know that we knew of oil in China going back to the 1700s, but
They probably some use of it, no industrial use, but just the scale of it
okay.
was there. And I mean, when was Pennsylvania founded? This was 1715. This is
Right.
right back up there. That was 150 years before an oil well in
Right.
America. But they always had it in their back pocket. And then the United States, another one of their colonies that broke away somewhat, also had gob loads of oil. And you're the British Empire. If you controlled the seas, then that would be yours. And so all the oil in the Middle East. And so if you think about the world and you think about oil, there's only a couple names you need to know. Alberta, maybe the sleeper, has a huge part of oil, and it's not open to competition like the Middle East. But in the Middle East, you have Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And let's throw in Palestine, Israel. Those are the five nodes of the world's oil. Everything else is a rounding error. All five of those are part of the British Empire. All five of those pieces are in their back pocket at different, they come and go, but Iran's oil, BP, that's Britain.
Absolutely.
Iraq, that's Britain. Between the First World War, that's Winston Churchill, who was half American, negotiating with the Americans about letting Americans in on Iraq.
Yeah,
So,
we forget Iran was BP as well. And
absolutely.
yep.
And so all of those were British. Palestine, British. The landed aircraft carrier in the region where the rest of the world gets its oil.
Right.
That's the importance of Palestine. And if you read the State Department studies during World War II about how we're going to organize the world oil industry, we're going to control Middle East oil. But that's not for us. That's for Europe. That's for the hemisphere. North American oil is for North America. We're going to have ours. The rest of the world is going to fight over there. Everyone has their fingers in it. You can't monopolize it. Everyone's going to fight over it. And so we need Palestine to police that area. The British controlled Iran, controlled Iraq, controlled Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. I also know, as an Albertan, that Alberta was given to America. That in 1898, 1 year after John D. Rockefeller had retired from Standard Oil secretly, they never told anybody for decades, but to keep his hands clean before things really got imperial, he retired. But in 1898, the federal government of Alberta changed the laws to secretly sell the Canadian oil industry to the Rockefellers as a gift from the British Empire to the Americans. We're going to start a war. We're going to thwart our continental competitors, Germany and Russia. There's a war coming, and we're going to need America to join us, and so we're going to need to pay. We're going to need to pay them. We're going to need to entice them, and so they gave Canada. And Alberta was created in 1905.
Makes sense.
Uh,
Yeah.
a couple months after the British Navy decided we're going to need that oil we found in 1715 up there in Alberta because the oil's coming. The British Navy in March 1905 said, oh, yeah, we got all that. So let's reserve that for our Navy. 6 months later, the province of Alberta is created out of thin air. It was just a no man's land. Maybe it'd be British, maybe it'd be American, but 1905, it settled. July 1906, the British Crown sells all the oil and gas in Alberta to the Rockefellers in London. July 9th, 1906. The Queen had just asserted Western Canada belongs to me, it's my personal property, and in 1906 she sells it to the Americans. So the Americans own it. And so that's one of the key pillars of the world empire. The Rockefellers own it. And to lock that down in 1935, the Rockefellers installed a government in Alberta. 26-year-old Bible student started a new political party with his Bible school teacher, who was a radio evangelist. In the first election, with this new technology of radio, elected American puppets, who gave the rest of the oil in Alberta, including the 175 billion barrels up in northern Alberta, gave it away at a meeting at the Premier's house. So they installed a government in 1935 that held a special session of the Alberta legislature in 1938 and passed a black letter law that there was a new regulator of the Alberta oil and gas industry. It's run by an American. I think 5 of the first 8 were Americans that ran it. And they passed black letter laws that say the regulator isn't accountable to the law. You can't appeal it to any court. It doesn't even have to write stuff down. And it never has to pay for cleanup.
Wow.
And that's settled.
Sounds like it's like a prefect almost. When I think about the prefects back to the Roman, sort of empire.
Surreal what was happening in the mid 30s when fascism is coming up. Another province of Canada, Newfoundland, the island out on the east coast, was also a British colony. Pretty good for defending this whole continent over there. It was almost a province, and in 1933 did something strange. Suspended democracy, suspended the legislature, had a vote and said, we're just giving up all this responsible government stuff. We're now a British colony again. It was way too important to leave dangling with World War II coming. So Newfoundland just like quit democracy, quit Canada in 1933 and appointed an American executive to run all of its financial affairs. Kind of like they were an American colony or something. And they just had a governor installed. And so in 1935, when they installed Ernest Manning as the acting premier of Alberta, he's 26 years old. He goes to Ottawa and he tells the bondholders to go screw themselves. Alberta's not paying. So Alberta's forced into insolvency for a decade.
Oh, wow.
And the American who's been running financial affairs in Newfoundland for the last couple of years, he comes to Alberta. Ernest Manning hires him, and he writes the first budget, and he runs the financial affairs of Alberta for the next couple of years. Robert Magor is his name, but it is really like a Roman prefect. They just install a governor, and Newfoundland still run the same sort of the way. The Irving family owns all the media, owns the oil industry, kind of like an imperial governor. Yeah. And Palestine kind of came to the same fate that once World War II was really happening, and America was still playing hard to get, trying to lure the Germans into attacking Russia, pretending we weren't going to join the war. And they certainly weren't until we had this Canada stuff locked down. Roosevelt gave him a list of the colonies that he wanted from Britain for joining the war, and Newfoundland and Canada was part of it. And he got all of those, and that's what they call the deal for the 50 battleships that they made to it's a story, but they wanted to formalize American ownership of Canada.
Wow.
So in August 1940, they signed the Ogdensburg Treaty. It's 130 words long, and it formally subjugates Canada permanently to the United States. And so in August 1940, that that was now it was legal. Now it was formal. The marriage was complete. Canada now officially belonged to America. And from then on, it would be safe for America to join. They had been paid. Newfoundland was in the deal, along with a bunch of Caribbean islands were thrown in. America got all of those at the time. And so, in case anyone thought that was just World War II and that was just about fighting the Nazis, that treaty from 1940, the Ogdensburg Treaty between Canada and the US, it was signed again in 1947. We signed it a second time just in case anybody thought that was just a World War II thing. So on February 12th, they signed it again because the next day they found a billion-barrel oil field in Alberta
Wow.
that had been sold to the Rockefellers in 1906. On February 13th, 1947, Leduc number 1, the start of the oil industry in Alberta, blew in to a crowd of hundreds. They knew it was coming. They planned it for the day after they re-signed the treaty. And then, oh, did you know that you could find oil in coral reefs? This is a new kind of oil, new kind of field, but hey, here it is. An Alberta oil industry was born on that day after we signed that treaty. And the way that you know that Palestine belongs to America, the same way that Canada belongs to America, is the very next day, on February 14th, 1947. That's when the British cabinet succumbed to British pressure, or to American pressure. After World War II, British was devastated, being stripped of its empire. That's a lot of loot no longer coming in, huge dramatic transition, and the US is strangling them. There's a severe shortage of coal, 2 million unemployed, the coldest winter in memory. Entire industry shut down, newspapers only printed some days of the week until British cabinet agreed to quit Palestine and to hand the issue over to the United Nations that America had recently created in a
Yes.
way that secreted colonies like Canada past the General Assembly's
Wow.
Decolonization Commission.
Wow.
And so on the very next day, they have Canada in their back pocket and they have their offshore aircraft carrier in the region. And February 1947 is also when the planning began for the ethnic cleansing that was part of the War of Independence, that it was with American support,
Sure.
American training. Some of the biological stuff that preceded was American stuff that wasn't indigenous.
Okay, let me add one thing to that that's extremely important that I don't want to forget, and I apologize for interrupting your stream of consciousness, which is incredibly helpful for me. But this is extremely important, okay? The scientists for the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer were mostly former Jewish nuclear physicists out of Nazi Germany, right? Okay? So what do? They figured out the atomic bomb. They freaking put it together in Alamos, New Mexico, and we know the story of Oppenheimer. Most people, I think, you know, through the film that we just recently had a couple of years ago that won the Academy Award, and I absolutely loved it. And I'm sure it missed quite a few things. But I've recently stumbled across, guys like I'm trying to think of his name. This guy's super involved with the CIA, American. I don't want to call it exceptionalism. I think that's his podcast, American Exceptionalism. And then there's this
Oh
also
yeah,
Ed,
yeah. Aaron Good.
yeah, Aaron Good is who I'm thinking of. Aaron Good, and also I've heard this stuff from and the other podcaster who works frequently with Michael Hudson. The what's it called? He does it out of China now.
Yeah,
And
yeah. The geopolitical.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Now, a lot of these guys have brought this up in the past, and I've always wondered if this is true though, because of what you're about to go into. Okay, so yeah, the British were getting strangled, I take it, after obviously being spent after World War II and all things that you're talking about in the sort of the backroom, decision making process that would hand. And I've never heard that before, but it's amazing to hear you make that correlation between what happened with Alberta and being colonized and the Palestinians or Palestinian territories or Palestine just writ large. But let's not forget that at this time period, and this might be a little bit reaching at the moment, but I do know that Robert Maxwell the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, was MI6. He had escaped the Holocaust. He was working. He was a traitor. He was involved with all sorts of stuff. And somebody whose name eludes me, but was involved with Maxwell potentially, whatever that Oppenheimer slash Manhattan project with all of the Jewish scientists, that technology, whether it was approved by the powers that be at that time or if it was clandestine, I'm not sure. Maybe it was contextually because, again, like I said, after the Holocaust, FDR, many times we all know that he didn't allow escaping Jewish people from really the horrors of the Holocaust to not land in the United States. They forced them to Israel, Palestine, and ultimately, though, somewhere in that context, the nuclear bomb became Israel's as well, or the development. And Israel was always initially thought they might have the technology, but somehow, and I don't even know how they did it because I don't know about the nuclear, if there are nuclear facilities in Israel or however, because they were able to obviously manifest that for supposedly defense. We could always talk about the geopolitics of everything else. The only other Islamic nation that ended up with the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon was Pakistan. What was that guy's name? That was the nuclear
Was it
scientist.
Khan?
What's his name?
Was it Amir Khan or
I
something
think it was
Khan?
Khan. It was Khan, exactly, right? Because there was all sorts of interesting stuff that was happening because of Pakistan, especially post 9/11.
As a U.S. ally.
As a
Yeah.
U.S. ally. As a U.S. ally. Okay.
Just like Iran under the Shah came close.
Okay, right. But what was so for since I can think of in the 90s, Netanyahu has been saying Iran has been on the cusp of achieving a nuclear weapon for that long. And of course, we had the attacks, back in June, and they're calling it now a 12-day war. But then this happened. And again, the same story is supposedly, the precursor for the offensive attack here, even though we know this has been on the books for 4 decades. So I give you that whole thing because you're on the roll about the mandates and everything else, but I want you to try to sequence that into your theory of what's next from the context of World War I didn't take more than a tripwire because of all the sort of geopolitical alliances and, of course, territory and yada, 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 which was really ridiculous. World War II made a lot more sense, but it was obviously a continuation of what took place, right? But I'm curious, given what I said about Iran and China and the Strait of Hormuz and, of course, the Suez Canal and everything else, not to mention what we've seen by way of, look, it was revealed in the Epstein files. I shit you not. This euthanasia program, this depopulation situation. This has always been kind of my theory since seeing, 9/11 through the wars through 2008, that somebody, whether it's a cabal of billionaire sycophants that are into predation, are just fine with half of the population, disappearing. But we're obviously at a stage now, right, where it seems imminent. And I wonder how you're parsing it all based on the historical roadmap. And I interrupted you, and I apologize, but I hope you can pick it up from where you were.
No, it's the perfect way to close the circle with the two other pieces I hadn't mentioned yet, Iran and Iraq. That's what brings together your story and mine, Iraq in 2003, leaving the only other peace on earth is Iran. It had been after the coup in 53. It was back to the American and British and Israeli orbit. Horrible place, but our ally. And so I think it's easier to make sense of what's happening today in a repolarizing world where the U.S. is cutting itself off from most of the world. That's what terrorism does. It polarizes. It creates us and them, and a lot of what the U.S. is doing is repolarizing the world. They're tightening their grip on everything they own, like Canada and all of its oil. Venezuela, which they used to own, it's kind of slipped their grasp, and they're reaching for it again. They have a firm grip on Iraq. All of the oil revenue from Iraq since the invasion still flows through New York first and only makes it to Iraqis by the grace of Washington. And so that only leaves Iran. And today, American empire is straining under the weight of the $71 trillion that
Right,
you've discovered,
right,
yet they've created. Free money they put in their pockets and sprinkle all over the world, but it's a financial asset and it comes with a corresponding and equal financial liability.
right,
And the money's been spent, and these idiots don't have a lot to show for it. But there's a lot of debts about to come due unless you can yell, fire, and scream, run for the exits.
right.
And
Which is what you've
so,
been saying the last 4 or 5 times we've been together.
and there's no more United Nations. The clock is ticking, and the U.S. is, I mean, they don't even put on a show under this war. They don't even deny it. But Iran is the
What about
last.
Russia? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Iran's the last bit of the oil in the Middle East that's up for grabs, that it isn't under their control, that the rest of the world relies on. China can't do its thing without, and that's why they don't need to win. They don't need to get control. They need to fuck it up.
Right, right,
just, just like in a colony, things aren't allowed to work here. Well, you're not in charge of foreign policy. Another thing colonies aren't in charge of is immigration policy.
mm,
And so Canada has been flooded with millions of immigrants, which is not necessarily a bad thing, except we don't give a shit about them. There's no programs, there's no nothing. It's as if to create chaos, as if to prevent us from having anything, doing anything. And the same thing's happening in Britain. It's great for undermining friends or allies. You would do that in Iran, and you would also do it in your friends. It undermines them. It keeps them from getting uppity, doing anything. And I think that's what Iran is about, is just taking one last swipe. And it puts the U.S. isn't quite as strong as it used to be or seems. The last attack in Iraq was a lot of show. It seemed like they just came in like they always do with air and bombed whatever they want, but it
Yeah, we're
wasn't.
good at the quick hit, but we're not good at the long term, right? And nor do we have.
Well, we weren't. I mean, we're not as big and dominant as you were in 1991, the first time Iraq happened.
Sure.
I mean, Venezuela is another thing. You can
Well,
have the
25
entire
years of war is
population against, but you can take out a little country, and that's a message to everybody. And Iran's not the same. There's no illusions. It's not like, oh, they don't
spiral.
know.
That was my question. It could spiral. So my question. So look, we both know unilateral, unipolar versus multipolar. But Russia is my big question because what's your theory on Putin? What is this? What are we looking at? Because it would have been a global war 35 years ago. There's no question in my mind.
Yeah,
But we've seen what happened in Syria. Go ahead.
it's it's all about timing. The US and Britain would have loved to do much of this forever, but this is the moment where Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, Israel does. There's a limit to how Iran can react against Israel. There's a limit to what Russia can do. It's tied up. It's years into Ukraine. It doesn't have the capacity elsewhere. Two more of Iran's neighbors are currently at war with each other, and both Pakistan and
India.
dominated by Americans. And so it's just an opportunity to get away with as much as you can, to do as much damage as you can, because adversaries who would usually limit your ability to carry out your demented schemes, they don't have the capacity. So you get away with what you can, and that is the American. They are pushing, just like JFK and Cuban Missile Crisis. They want you to think they're crazy. They're going to push their limits because their dominance is fading every day. The relative power is shrinking. Tomorrow, they'll get away with less. This is the last chance. We're hoping to be able to shape the outcome before the end of the Trump regime, to be able to pick up the pieces and remake the system. They want it to crash so the rich can all escape their debts. And so
What it is.
one way or
That's
the other, they
that's
need
what it is.
war, $200 oil. And so they started it, but they didn't cut off oil. And so they had to assassinate the leader and then his son because they need everything to blow up quick. Because
Again,
if
yeah,
it
because
doesn't,
okay, what is Iran going to do, right? Remember those waves of those millions of soldiers, foot soldiers, going into the desert against Iraq that Saddam laid out. I mean, they were under equipped, but they just suicide wave after suicide wave. I was triggered by that. I was like, are they, in light of the supreme leader being assassinated, I'm like, okay, they've got capacity. There's no question. They're hitting Tel Aviv. They're hitting, the Strait of Hormuz or Hormuz. They, like I said, they nicked. Maybe it was just a message to, excuse me, Dubai, and then so on and so forth. Whatever happens in Qatar, which I guess would be Doha City. But anyway, they have capacity, but they got 90 million people, right? And now they've also just had they've almost had a revolution and a civil war, for the last 30 years. I mean, really more so the last 15 years. I think back maybe 5 years ago when they were brutal towards women, for example, right? And there was that international Iranian soccer star who I want to say may have been killed or imprisoned that launched a lot of other things. I mean, look, the iron grip of power by the Iranian, hierarchy has had decimating consequences on because Iran's population has always been educated. They've always been, quite frankly, I think the culture has been a zenith, of Islamic sort of consideration, or I should say, what was sort of influence, not just influence, going back to Persia, but I mean, it has an educated population. You know what I mean? There's been that struggle since the Islamic Revolution, but before that, of course, the corruption as manifested by the English Empire, and yet there's been an undergirding of this population that has sought freedoms, and I've known that for like my best friend in high school was Iranian, who escaped the Iranian Revolution of that time, and I had kind of a view into that world. So to me, it seems like maybe there could be a civil war, of course, which is ironic considering the religious authoritarianism by a pedophilia racketeer in chief in the United States that's all about evangelicals and Christo nationalism, i.e., Christo fascism, right? So it's all bullshit in terms of liberating. It is exactly what you said, plus the thing that I didn't consider, which is the debts that they're going to erase for the world's elite, which is like, okay, there's another trick, of which, of course, the $71 trillion truth reveals. But I want to insert this and then give you closing thoughts here. So to whoever is watching this, please like, subscribe, and share to the information that we're putting out all the time, because as dire as it all is, as dark as it all is, I want to say this to the world and my Canadian friends and everyone else, and I know you know this, okay? I think a lot of you have lost faith in the American people, as you should have, because we are not, we are pathetic compared to what we once were. We have people so in their phones, they don't even know what's going on. In fact, I saw what the two Canadian gay hockey player guys on SNL, even though I don't know the whole story, was trending in the midst of all this insanity, right? It's like people are looking to like pop culture, even though I'm sure it's extremely important to people who, relegate in that sort of that scenario, because I'm sure there's important things they talk about. It's not global war, and it's not this 40 years of this Epstein class that have led to this situation, which literally you and I both know makes it look like we're on the verge of something really huge, because it's been big for the last 25 years at least, but this is like next level, I think. Now, the key component of what it is that we do with the Clean New Deal is we know all of the different pieces that have created this criminal empire that is built on a facade of money to the criminals that have destroyed us. I call it socialism for criminals. That's what the American people need to get their heads around first and foremost, especially those of you who think about the affordability crisis. You think about the four walls of your creation. You're like, oh, shit, here's another war. There's nothing I can do about it. I couldn't do anything about the last 30 years. I got to protect my family. I'm going to vote accordingly. Or maybe I won't vote because I don't even have a vote. Nobody's representing my interest anyway. There's this apathy in the United States. It's like we're dead. We have no freaking life in us because nobody has a direction because everybody's getting played. We've just seen Hakeem Jeffries taking money for AIPAC, even though, of course, that is really, unpopular based on polls with Democrats all over the Northeast because of the issue with the genocide, because of what's happened with Netanyahu and all things Palestine or the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, as a result of all of what's led up to this moment. But yet, here's their influence, right? And we know that the Democrats have been as complicit in hiding whatever the mechanics of the Epstein class has been as were the Republicans. This has been 4 decades of this criminal cartel class that's undergirded by the fossil fuel countries and corruption that's been laundered into Ivy League institutions, that's been laundered into the highest white shoe law firms, that's been responsible for buying Congress, that bought our freaking media. And so here's a Jewish guy, even though I told you all the background and you can filter out what you want to think about that. But I'm telling you, Ellison is exactly what the Jews were accused of by owning media and Wall Street or finance. And he's acting exactly as millennia have decried certain Jews, right? Or just Jews in general that led to the Holocaust. And yet the Epstein class and some of these guys that are now like, we don't care about the law. We don't care about human rights. We don't care about, we care about Palantir. We care about weeding out the population. We care about AI and we care about propaganda. And I'm like, what the fuck? I'm serious, man. That was not me in 1987. Have I sold you? Do you believe me? Have I seen the world differently now than I did when I was, 40 years ago? My God, people. And the reason, because what Reagan said, and I'll let him finish, but this is the key consideration for me. I had my life turned upside down. I got destroyed in 2008. I started asking questions. I started pulling the thread. And because I had just enough knowledge of how systems are supposed to work, that I start to figure out how they didn't work, which then made complete sense, because at that time, the world made no sense to me, as it might for many of you. But what we're telling you is we have the answers. We know who did what, when, and how. We know how they operate. We know how they do it on a geopolitical scenario. We know how fossil fuel is the baseline. We know how finance is the trick. And we know how they stole $71 trillion to loot and to create this empire of illusion that is like this Machiavellian, like satanic ritual of the worst blood libel. And I'm like, do you guys not fucking appreciate irony? Are you out of your freaking minds playing roulette with the world? And they're going to dominate. I swear to God, I feel like we're right on the edge of even a more monstrous stupidity of World War I that's going to lead to a nuclear holocaust, because there's going to be waves of suicide bombers that head toward, or suicide, militia, whatever you want to call them, just the military of Iran, under-equipped, but at the same time, they've got the numbers. Let's say they throw, massive volumes of troops, and then the Israel's their answer, or let's just say the USS Ford and whatever carrier group. Yeah, we got nuclear weapons. We got nuclear weapons. We could start a nuclear war in the Middle East. For what purpose? To give Donald Trump absolute freaking control? The Clean New Deal was and is the only peaceful direction to turn the tables on this monstrosity, because of what Reagan said many times, not just today, but in every conversation we've had. It's the law. It's simply the fucking law. When you have Bill Black and the new untouchables in a position of power with the evidence to do what they have to do, you use the police to arrest the bad guys based on the evidence. That's the law. That's the Constitution. That's everything we are on the eve of the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States of the American Revolution. I could go on for hours. I'm just going to leave it to you to close out. I hope I didn't say anything that was wrong. I don't think I did.
Not at all. I would just want to finish with two things that you know how banking works and oil works, so you know it's not the Jews. And it's as simple as that. And the same goes for the Israelis. They're many things. They're a military power. They may even be a high-tech power, but they're not a finance power. And there's a reason, because finance is collateral. Full stop. That's all it is. And it's the king and his friends who have all the world's collateral. That's why it's London and New York and not Tel Aviv that have the money. They're really deciding. Money is always happy to dangle some Jews in front, to put on a show, to have a handy scapegoat. And some may be willing to play that role.
I was going to say
But,
some do. As I pointed out, Larry Ellison is playing a good role of it right
um,
now. Good.
and that's one of their highest achievements of imperialism, is that doing that to Jews. The Israelis now playing that in, like, wow, you can do that to the survivors of the Holocaust. You can take that and transform that into Israeli society today. That shows you the power of this imperial system we're part of. And our one way to look at the role for me and you in this system is to simply expose the character of the people running it, so that everybody else can see they're naked, don't need to take them seriously, don't need to try to make sense of their today's stupidity and yesterday's. We can expose them. And so we hear a lot about Islamic culture or anyone else. And so I think it pays to give a little bit of attention to the Epstein class, to the imperial class's culture, what that looks like. Because I live in Alberta, and it was created in 1905. And in 1906, they opened the first intern camp for Aboriginal youth, mandatorily rounding up all the First Nations youth and putting them into schools so that they would get tuberculosis. The schools were designed to spread airborne disease, and the Indian Affairs Department of the federal government appointed a chief medical officer from America. He was the president of the Public Health Organization of America, came to be the chief medical officer of the Indians, and went to the schools in Alberta and said, it's like they were built to spread tuberculosis. And then he went back a few years later and he's at 85% of the kids got tuberculosis. And he'd tell his boss, everybody's dying of tuberculosis. And the head of Indian education in Canada, in the first invocation of the final solution, wrote a famous memo in 1910 saying that he's perfectly aware that kids die a lot higher numbers at school than they do back home, but that's no reason to change policy when we're pursuing a final solution with the First Nations.
Oh my God, that's what they called it?
Yes, in 1910.
Oh my God.
And by the end of the First World War, they'd killed 20,000 Indians in Alberta. They'd wiped out 40% of the Blackfoot in southern Alberta, where I lived. And then when they installed the premier in 1935, they kicked it up a notch again. In the 30s and 40s, another 40,000 Indians were killed in Alberta because they live on top of the oil.
Oh my
And
God.
so when COVID came around this time, and the first couple of waves, it was different. Canadians really rallied together. And before we had masks and testing and stuff, there was an amazing amount of public health awareness and public-minded, that even before we had vaccines, that the COVID was almost licked until all public health measures stopped in Canada, in Alberta. In these days, you can't get a test. There's no sorts of public health measures, and it just runs rampant. And another reflection of that in Canada, because we're a colony, and because there's a different mindset that if we ran our own affairs, we'd want to prosper. But if we were a colony, you wouldn't want too many people living on top of your stuff.
Right.
And so in Alberta, we have state-assisted suicide.
Oh my God.
You guys had the Dr. Kevorkian and the whole thing in America. Here, it's official policy that the government will step in and do it. And you might come in because you're overweight and ask some advice to your doctor. They'll let you know about the MAID program, where they have medically assisted suicide. And that's by now, this has been around for a couple of years now. And there's been many scandals in the media of people stuck in hallways at hospitals for days on end with bed sores that take suicide as one of the options and get it in Canada, to the point where medically assisted suicide is now the number one cause of death in Canada. 5% of deaths are medically assisted. And there's a number of laws in the works to further ease the rules around imposing this. And
My God. I was
none
thinking
of that makes
Canada.
much sense
I was thinking
unless
Canada's
we're a
like looking
colony.
out for Canadians. My God. Except if you're, I guess you're the Blackfoot. Holy shit. Well, now everybody else. My God, dude. Okay, look, a couple of things for me to close it out. Like, first of all, thank you for saying it's not the Jews, it's the oil and the finance. And we know that there's a lot of high level Jews in oil and finance, but at the same time, like I've said many times, there's a lot of Jews on the right side of this. So please,
Amen.
people, just understand that humans are flawed, but the sickness in the disease is corruption that leads to lies. That's the pollution of the spirit that can lead then to the pollution of our literal planet where we're on the last leg. This is 2026. We just got rid of all environmental regulation last week that was fomented by All Things Heritage Foundation that came out in this freaking goon that came out of Oklahoma's oil industry, who's director of EPA, that's like, yep, done with the endangerment clause. We can all just poison everybody. And you wait, man. All those guys down in Baytown and all of those folks in Shreveport and all of those, refineries, yeah, they're as good as gone. Okay. Not to mention what's going to happen in the basin of Los Angeles and all, but even though I guess California will keep its restrictions, I don't know how that works federally. But the bottom line is this administration, which is just the expression of imperialism. Donald Trump is not the mastermind of anything. He's been a player that's gone along with this whole thing from Roy Cohn forward. His grandfather was a complete fraud who was a literal pimp, and they were all about theft and deception for generations. And Trump is no different. And he was elevated through all sorts of back channels with Russia and the Rothschilds and this, that, and the other that led to Adelson, that led to these bad groups where they stole the election or did whatever they had to do with January 6th and everything else. And most of the American people were just like, have faith in the system. Have faith in the system that has been really betraying us as far as, Reagan and I know, at least since the late 80s, I'm going to say on overdrive in terms of the mass financial fraud and deregulation that would lead to this global laundering opportunity for the criminal class of all of the worst oligarchs in the world, quite frankly, which undergirded everything through, oil. And we have a chance if millions of you can get your mind, if you're sick of the depravity of perversion, the pollution of destruction, the pollution of malfeasance, and you get hit with the clarity of truth, which is the Clean New Deal. It lays it all out. Reagan has been a great spokesperson and a great thank you for reminding us that we have the answers, but it really comes down to the law and economics. And we've got answers to both, to regulate both and to hold the bad guys accountable, to rewrite the ship. There's a reason a plane flies. There's a reason a ship floats. The system has to work. But what we're on is the Titanic. And of course, the billionaires have got their life rafts and they're waiting for us all to drown because we're expendable until we're not. Did I get that wrong? Am I right?
Amen.
Amen. All right, my friends, everyone, Regan Boycheck. I'll put articles and links to his wonderful pieces down below in the description. Until next time, be well. Thank you, as always, for being a friend and a colleague. And I look forward to talking to you next time. All the best.
Take care.